second and of course our last panel for today. I think the first one was already very fascinating. And now we come to our fourth speaker, Mr. Jan Graf. I hope I see him somewhere here. There he is. Hello. Yes. And Jan Graf, as a social worker and intercultural specialist, he has been working with young refugees already since several years. For example, he worked as a caretaker in different forms of youth welfare services, and he was responsible for the implementation of various education and participation projects. Since last year, 2021, he has been part of the mental health and psychosocial support unit of the International Organization for Migration Germany and the U-Care project team. And Jan, the floor is yours.
Yeah, hello everyone, good evening. Many thanks for the introduction, many thanks for the invitation, and many greetings from Berlin. So let me share my screen and start my presentation. So now I have to just find a way to put on the full screen. Yeah, so you can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Yeah, so I have chosen the title Lost and Transition for my presentation because it refers to a famous movie you might know, but more importantly, it refers to the very difficult transition process that unaccompanied and separated children have to face once they entered a European member state and applied for asylum or for protection. And I would like to use the next 15 to 20 minutes to take a look at the many challenges unaccompanied minors have to face, and to highlight why this transition process, so the transition from the child protection system to adulthood and to an independent life, is such an enormous challenge for this specific target group of young children. And so we will take a look at the situation of unaccompanied minors, and I will also present the findings of the U-Care project. And so before I start with my input, a very brief look at our project. Don't worry, I don't want to use my time to advertise our project, but I guess it's important for the background, so that all of you know what the objectives are. So U-Care is an acronym for Unaccompanied Children in Alternative Residence, and the objective or the main goal of the project is to improve and strengthen alternative care systems for unaccompanied and separate children in Belgium, Germany, and Greece. So U-Care is an international project. Next to the IOM mission in Germany, also our colleagues in Belgium and Greece are involved. And my colleagues in Greece and Belgium, they are focusing on the recruitment of foster care providers. So when unaccompanied and separate children enter the European Union, they're either placed in, I mean, there are differences among the European member states, but in a simplified manner, we can say that they're either placed in a foster or a guest family, or they're placed in a youth welfare institution, or a shelter, which is particularly designed for the needs of unaccompanied children. So my colleagues, they're focusing on the topic of foster care and the recruitment of foster care providers. And IOM Germany, my mission is concentrating or focusing on older unaccompanied children or unaccompanied minors. And so this includes all children and young adults from the age of 16 to the age of 21. Other objectives is the training and capacity building of professionals and care providers, and the organization of transnational exchange of best practices. So, and over the past 12 months, we have worked closely with various youth welfare organizations who are in charge or responsible for the care and assistance of unaccompanied children or unaccompanied refugees in Germany. And above all, or more importantly, we are in close exchange with unaccompanied children who are currently living in a youth welfare organization or in a residential group, and with unaccompanied young adults. So young adults who who lived in a youth welfare organization and now transitioned to an independent life. And we have regular focus group discussions. So the young adults and the unaccompanied minors, they're really closely involved in the whole development process of the care concepts. And I guess that's a particularity of the project, that we really try to involve the children and young adults in the whole development process, and that they really have the space and also the time to point out their wishes, their experiences, and also their suggestions for improvement of the care systems. Before we take a closer look at the transition to adulthood and all the challenges and obstacles, a brief look at the overall situation of unaccompanied and separated children. So unaccompanied children are among the most vulnerable groups of migrants and refugees, and the reasons why these children leave their home country without their family are manifold. So they are forced to flee from danger, from crises, from conflict, and many of them are also seeking a better future overall. And these reasons, so the reasons can be political, they can be environmental, social, or economical, but in the most cases, and this is also the experience you get when you're working with these children, this is usually, it's not a single reason. So these in real life or in practice, these reasons overlap, and usually there are several reasons why they left their home country without their parents or a caregiver. And the fact that they're underage and start their journey, their desperate journey without their caregivers, of course, exposes them to many dangers on their flight or their migration route, and also exposes them particularly to become victim of human trafficking. So unaccompanied minors are not only a particular vulnerable group, they're also a particular burdened group of migrants. Many international studies show that unaccompanied minors go through more traumatic experiences and suffer more frequently from mental disorders compared to other refugee minors or adults. So unfortunately, I missed the first half an hour, but I know that there was already a presentation of regarding unaccompanied minors. So I hope I don't repeat the points, but in general, and this is also my experience working in direct practice with these youngsters for many years. We have PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, and they also often experience severe anxiety, depression, and psychosomatic disorders. And yeah, they must cope with this situation without the support of their parents, and at the same time, they must orientate themselves in a new cultural environment. And so there are many challenges and obstacles at the same time and in parallel that they have to go through and to overcome. And these challenges are often described with the concept of the so-called concept of triple transitions. So first of all, we have the transition every human being is experiencing. So the transition from adolescence to adulthood with all the related cognitive changes and emotional changes. We have the transition related to migration that leads to the detachment from the country of origin and the need to build up a new life in a foreign environment, in a foreign cultural environment and social environment. And we have the transition related to overcoming trauma that experienced in the home country or during the flight. So overall, a very difficult starting position. Once unaccompanied children reach the European Union or Germany, I've chosen there are differences, as I said before, among the European member states, but overall, specific safeguards and regulations apply regarding their accommodation, care, and assistance. So in Germany, now I'm taking a look at the situation in Germany, and this is also the figure which is shown here that shows or gives an overview of the whole process of accommodation, care, and assistance. So once unaccompanied refugee or migrant enters Germany and they are taken into care by the local youth welfare officers. So the German Youth Welfare Department or the local youth welfare officers, they're responsible for the care and the assistance of these youngsters. And when they're taken into care, this is this first step that we see here on the left side. Initial clarification is carried out. So it is the social workers try to clarify what the family situation is, if the health status of the young person, and also all the next important steps that are relevant for the asylum process, for the integration process, also for the further education and so on and so on. And care is provided, accommodation is provided, and also a legal guardian is appointed. And after this first step, called preliminary taking into care, the youngsters are, next steps follow. But what I want to point out is this is actually quite a systematic and also well-functioning system of care and assistance. The major problem, or the biggest problem of the system, is that it usually ends once the minors turn 18. And there is a chance that youth welfare services are prolonged up to the age of 21, but for the vast majority, youth welfare services come to an abrupt end with the 18th birthday. And this is what makes the transition to adulthood such an enormous challenge. So this overall phase let's say from the 17th birthday up to the point once they turn 18, is really a phase fraught with many challenges and obstacles. So when they turn 18, they lose the particular safeguards they were entitled to when they were minors, and all the essential support structures, such as residence permits, accommodation, access to youth welfare services, and also the guardianship comes to an end at the same time. So there are many transitions at the parallel again, and at the same time they have to overcome. And another key challenge is also the short amount of time available to prepare the youngsters for a self-managed life in Germany or another European member state. So more than the half of the youngsters arriving in Germany, this is now not for the European Union, for that's the case in Germany, more than the half of the youngsters are in the ages between 16 and 18. So considering that for the majority of these youngsters, the support provided by the youth and welfare system ends when they reach adulthood, there's very little time left to actually prepare the newcomers for a self-managed life here in Germany. So the education situation has to be clarified, language acquisition, a lot of different tasks related to the integration, and in the end also a housing solution has to be found, and job training has to be started. So this is supposed to happen in the end in this 1.5 years after the arrival in Germany. So I guess it's obvious that and actually also all the local authorities and caretakers, everybody is aware that this time is actually way too short to adequately prepare a young person for these challenges. And a central finding, not only of our project, this is also commonly known, is that there's a lack of specific support structures that accompany this very critical transition phase. So besides some local initiatives or some initiatives by NGOs, there are simply no structures that really support this critical time. And this is a reason why the transition to adulthood is such a challenging and also decisive phase for these youngsters. And because of these missing structures, a lot of these young persons, after a short time of relatively stability when they were in the youth welfare system and they had care and assistance was provided, again they come into they face the risk of marginality, and many of them again experience existential crises. And now I come quick look at the numbers to really highlight the point, how important or how devastating this lack of these support structures at this transitional phase is. So what we see here at this figure is the number of unaccompanied minors who were placed in the German youth welfare system between 2015 and 2020. And what we see is that at the end of 2015, more than 65,000 unaccompanied minors and unaccompanied young adults, this is the orange part, indicates the number of young adults. The blue part indicates, the blue part indicates the number of unaccompanied minors. And so we see the end of 2015 and the peak of the so-called refugee crisis. We had more than 65,000 children and young adults in the youth welfare system, in the German youth welfare system. And what we can see in the between 2015 and 2020, this number declined drastically from 56,000 to about 21,000. But what we can also see is that at the end of 2020, there were actually more young adults in the German youth welfare system than minors. So all this huge intake, or the huge number of young persons who entered the German youth welfare system in the year 2014, 2015, 2016, they are now young adults. But this number, what we see here at the end of 2020, these are only the young persons who are actually granted further assistance up to the age of 21. There's a way higher number of young adults who already dropped out of the German youth welfare system, or whose youth welfare services were terminated. So we have a large number of young persons or young adults who are pretty much lost without support, struggling to find their way to an independent life in Germany. And these are the findings of our project, and also the findings of the exchange with unaccompanied minors who are still living in a youth welfare organization or institution, or in a residential group, and young adults who already live in their own apartment. So one aspect that was really pointed out or really highlighted by the youngsters were the limited social support networks. So formal and informal networks play a really decisive role in overcoming the many challenges related to this transition phase. But since many of the young, since they are only in Germany for quite a limited time, also their social networks are very limited, and they're almost completely limited to the youth welfare system. So once youth welfare services are terminated and they have to move out, have to move to their own flat, to their own apartment, also all their social environments dissolves or breaks apart. And this is something that was highlighted many times, that this time was experienced as a very, very difficult and also dark time, where they experienced loneliness, and they were also overwhelmed by all the bureaucratic duties they had, and all the bureaucratic matters that they then suddenly had to face on their own. So it is very, very important. This is one of the central findings that we have, to promote the young persons to establish a social network, formal or informal, that is not limited to the youth welfare system. And this is also the starting point of one of our concepts. I will come back to this later, or in a minute.
Jan, excuse me, you have 2 more minutes left.
Okay. So I'm speeding up the whole process. Okay, another finding is that securing adequate accommodation is very, very difficult. So and this is also a difficulty. This is linked to a lot of anxiety and concerns for the young persons, because finding an accommodation is, especially in the bigger cities in Germany, became a real challenge. And for unaccompanied young adults who have also maybe limited resident permissions, it is almost impossible to find an adequate flat or an adequate apartment in Germany. And so this is linked, this uncertainty linked to the housing situation once youth welfare services end, is a huge problem. And many of the young persons reported that there was no space or no time left to concentrate on other important topics. That this anxiety of losing their accommodation or not having a secure prospect for their future housing or accommodation, that this is, it's a huge problem for the whole integration process. And last but not least, I will come to an end in 1 minute. It is another huge issue and problem for these youngsters is the lack of continuity and social stability. So once youth services come to an end, all the persons they know, all the faces they that accompanied them in the past 1 or 2 years, they're gone from one day to another. And especially during this critical time, they need social stability, and they need a person that they can relate on. And so what we found out that volunteer guardianships are one essential link to bridge this gap. But I'm afraid my time is over, and I because it would still take some time to point this out. But many thanks for your attention, and if you have further questions, I guess we would have 1 or 2 minutes. But you can also, this is what my closing remark. I'm also you're invited to get back to me, especially also when you're interested in the concept that we developed with the youngsters. And I'm happy to share further findings and also our concepts of our project. So thanks a lot for your attention.
Yes, Jan, thank you for presenting to us this important research topic. And I personally find this interesting because I worked in a similar project some years ago. And I found it also interesting that the situation for these youngsters changes again when some of them are put together again with families, because many aims that they reached were thrown back, especially girls and young women and so on when they came. But maybe I would suggest that we leave the option for questions or comments for the end of the panel.
Okay.
So then, because we go further with our next speaker, who will introduce to us also examples from the past with with teenagers and so on. And our next speaker is Chiara Renzo, who holds a PhD in history from the joint doctoral program of the Universities of Florence and Siena. Her research focuses on the Jewish displaced persons in post-war Italy. And she wrote a really fascinating article for a research journal, which we are editing together. And I have to admit that Chiara is putting much more work in it and is really more involved than me. So thank you, Chiara, here.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me in this very interesting
I just
program.
want to say that this is not everything that you did, but you are also a postdoc at the University of Florence, where Chiara is working on a project related to the fascist internment system during the Second World War. And she was a Rothschild Foundation Hannah D. Euro postdoc fellow at the University of Venice, yes, and a postdoc fellow in Yad Vashem. And now it's up to you. No, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Verena. I tried to share the screen first of all. I think that you can see now, probably full screen. Okay. Okay. So first of all, good evening from Italy, and thank you, Verena and Boaz Cohen, for inviting me. I'm really happy to be involved in your program. So my presentation today deals with the experience of the Jewish displaced children in post-war Italy, and I will focus on the role of the Jewish soldiers serving in the Allied Army and the Zionist emissaries from Palestine who laid the ground for a particular kind of rehabilitation program in children homes or youth villages that in the context of the refugee camps in post-war Italy were part of a net of Aksharot. This Hebrew term means preparation, and it refers to a sort of collective living inspired by kibbutz lifestyle, where adults, youth, or children could receive the necessary training for emigration to Palestine. It was, of course, more than this and more complicated than this, but this is like a sort of general definition. First of all, I would like to start my presentation providing you some context on post-war Italy. My starting point for this analysis is summer 1943, when Italy was a country split into two, as you can see from this map. The Allied Army liberated southern Italy, arriving from North Africa, while at the same time the fascist regime collapsed. The monarchy, the Italian monarchy, and the provisional head of the government fled to South Italy under the Allies and signed an armistice, which declared Italy's surrender. However, at the same time, Mussolini, supported by the Germans who invaded Italy from the north, was able to establish the Italian Social Republic. In this part of Italy, still under Nazi and Mussolini's rule, in 1943 marked the beginning of violence and deportation to Nazi extermination camps. More than 6,800 Jews were deported from Italy in this last phase of the war, and this number includes both Italian and non-Italian Jews. The second point I would like to stress is related to the fascist internment system. When Italy entered the war in 1940, the fascist regime interned all those people who were considered dangerous in the specific circumstances of the war, including 400 Italian Jews suspected mainly on a political basis and 6,000 foreign Jews classified as enemy aliens. They were interned in concentration camps. You must consider that there were dozens of concentration or internment camps in Italy. They were also sent to what in Italian is called confino libero, which is translated with this nonsense free internment, which is a sort of house arrest in small towns far from the main military strategic areas. And although the living conditions in these concentration sites were considered bearable, at least until 1943, after the armistice, some of these sites, I'm referring to those in the occupied, in the non-liberated Italy, became part of that mechanism of deportation to Nazi extermination camp. Why am I emphasizing this aspect? Because in 1943, when the Allies invaded South Italy, the first corps of Jewish DPs was formed by around 2,000 non-Italian Jews liberated by the from the fascist concentration camp of Ferramonti in Calabria, which is the region forming the foot of Italy. And as you know, among the Allied army were also the so-called Palestinian units, formed by Jewish soldiers from Palestine who enrolled as volunteers in the British Army during the North African campaign and who later formed the better known Jewish Brigade. Ferramonti was the key site where liberated Jews met for the first time Jewish soldiers who provided them help and assistance while the war was still going on and all the borders were closed and no humanitarian mission was allowed to work in Italy. These soldiers were mainly young men in their 20s or graduate from of Zionist youth movement, members of kibbutzim, who in their oral testimonies and official reports insist on their instinct. They all often use this word instinct that moved them to prioritize children and youth in this early phase of the rescue operation. At the end of January 1944, the Jewish soldiers informed the Jewish agency about the upcoming selection of the first group of 20 children from Feramonti for the creation of the first Akshara, which was called Rishonim, the first ones, established nearby Bari, which is in the region forming the Hill of Italy. Jewish soldiers' testimonies and reports shed light on another important aspect. The initial idea to run these programs in a general Zionist framework, avoiding partisanship, in order to not compromise Zionist unity. The Jewish soldiers running the Rishonim Akshara, Tzvi Ankuri, said, the idea was not to give up to ideology, but to get different Zionist ideology working together. Rishonim was the only Akshara kibbutz which had participants from Betar and Hashomer HaTzair, as well as Bahad. This first and only example, challenging and successful unique experience, was later to be changed with the political criterion taking precedence in the Aliyah selection. Ankuri referred to the fact that later the Aksharot became affiliated to different political parties, which, in a way that reflected their political consensus in Palestine, ruled the Jewish DP's migration quotas to Palestine. In 1944, the criteria used by the Jewish soldiers for selecting the candidates among the few displaced children in Feramonti are not clear. So we can only assume what motivated parents to entrust their children to the Jewish soldiers. Aksharot for children or children homes, first of all, responded to daily problems and offered an educational program and a concrete project of resettlement, especially after the war, when unaccompanied children or orphans arrived in Italy with the help of the Jewish soldiers. Many of them saw in these Aksharot or children homes a warm surrogate family. Rethinking about his decision to join the Rishonim Akshara a long time later, Shaul Hirsch was 14 years old at that time, said, each of us had a broken identity. Zionism was the answer to this problem. Thus, we became enthusiastic Zionists. We saw before us the adult generation who got lost. Their wish was to go back somewhere. They believed that the war would end and they would resume their lives just from the point where they had left them off. We were young, but none of us believed it or wanted it. In May 1944, all Rishonim children legally moved to Palestine, except for two of them whose parents did not want to let them go alone. They were replaced mainly by children just arrived with their family from Yugoslavia by the sea to Puglia, which is the region forming the Hill of Italy. However, already in October 1944, Rishonim closed and all its members were sent to another Akshara, the Akshara Habonim, in Santa Maria al Bagno di Camp, which is located in the southern edge of the Hill of Italy. This camp was established by the Allies in the late 1943, and the refugees were essentially accommodated in clusters of villas like the colorful one that you can see in this photo. These villas were requisitioned by the Allies, but normally were used as summer holiday residence by the local owners. Among the Abonim group coming from Yugoslavia was also the teenager Flora Calderon, originally from Serbia, who arrived in Italy at the beginning of 1944 with her parents and brother, escaping from the Croatian coast. Flora, portrayed in the black and white picture, described her time in Abonim as a happy time, and described the Jewish soldiers running the Akshara, Josef Fleischmann, as everything, I'm quoting, everything for the youth group. He was our teacher, our guide, and our parent. She said that during her experience in the Habonim Akshara, he learned Hebrew songs, he learned how to cultivate the land and to manage this collective life with her young friends. The end of the military operation, however, brought new Jewish DPs into Italy, including many children, and at the same time, new actors began to assist them. Verena before mentioned the UN agency, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, and also the International Refugee Organization. There were also Jewish voluntary organizations, and especially the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which is also known as Joint. And also there were political emissaries coming from Palestine, who were representative of Zionist, non-Zionist, religious, secular movements that at that time animated the issue. The involvement of these emissaries increased the number of the Aksharot in the country, but at the same time compromised the initial idea to avoid partisanship. Just to give you some numbers related to 1947, when the Jewish DP presence in Italy reached the peak, the total number of Jewish refugees in Italy was around 25,000, and 1/3 of them was distributed in 77 Aksharot. Among these, there were also six Aksharot for children, and as you can see, they were affiliated to different political parties. And as already anticipated, also after the first experiment of the Jewish soldiers, factionalism won over Zionists United, and Aksharot began to be managed by an umbrella organization coordinating all these political parties, which was called Merkaz Chalutz, the Pioneer Center. The Pioneer Center played a leading role in designing the educational program for children, both in the Aksharot, where it directly dictated the guidelines, and indirectly in the refugee camps through the member working within the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. One of them was the man that you can see in this photo, surrounded by children. His name was Tzvi Aldubi. He was sent to Santa Maria al Bagno in 1946 and worked as coordinator of the cultural affair. I had the chance to access his private archives with other two colleagues, Achinoam Aldubi and Michal Peles Almagor. And with them, we are working on the role of theater as a cultural training for Aliyah. And indeed, today I'm showing you this picture because these soldiers and emissaries arriving from Palestine brought their ideologies among the children, but also their way to educate them towards their prospected future in Palestine. Aldubi Private Archives documented the tensions behind the development of such educational activities, helping us to understand how culture behind ideology was envisaged as a powerful political tool, both for the rehabilitation of the children and for building their pioneering identity. Aldubi believed that, I'm quoting, the sons of Israel, as he used to say, should be educated within a Jewish and preferably a Zionist surrounding. For instance, he was very concerned about the fact that some teenager in the camp attended the Italian school in the nearby town. From Aldubi perspective, these children educated, I'm quoting, in the shadow of the cross, in Jesuit school, on the knees of the clergy, end of the quote, risk to compromise their Jewish identity. Moreover, Aldubi arranged several recitals and plays for children. Very frequently, he organized public events which serve as a medium to reach the camp population at large, kindling their sense of belonging to a specific ethnic and national group, as Aldubi used to say. In the school exhibition organized by Aldubi for children, redemption, heroism, and sacrifice emerge as common themes, also typical of the Zionist pioneering repertoire. For instance, during this recital, he associated the heroic feats of the biblical figures and the enterprises of the pioneers in the land of Israel to the Jewish DP's resistance and struggle for Aliyah in the DP camp. Another key site for Jewish displaced children in Italy was Selvino Children Home, which was established and run by another Jewish soldier, Moshe Zeiri. It was established in a former fascist boarding school called Scesopoli in the foothills of the Alps. Selvino Children Home was one of the many, was often considered a sort of model, a children paradise, and was indeed a place where hundreds of Jewish children, many of whom were orphans, found their home and war environment after the war. Zeiri managed Selvino Children Home according to the secular socialist principles of his movement, Cordonia. Children study half a day and dedicated the rest of the time to housework and agricultural work. And the goal of the AMCHA was to teach children collective responsibility, self-help, and mutual aid. Selvino, as one of the most documented children home in Italy, can help us understand the challenges of this model of collective rehabilitation and the debate and tensions behind the activities of the Jewish soldiers and the emissaries from Palestine. For instance, some of the workers of the joint expressed their doubts regarding this one-directional discipline and perceived the Zionist children home as a form of control over the Jewish DP's education and resettlement. The discussion mainly revolved around the personality and pedagogical approach of Selvino leader, who was recognized as a paternal figure, but also as a strong and sometimes authoritative leader who sacrificed children's needs for his political ideals. Other workers of the joint instead really appreciate and consider his work as I can say almost perfect. It comes to light that children homes based on a collective way of life smothered the individual needs of the children. For example, Zeiri discouraged the choice of the children to join their relatives in the refugee camps. This was the case of Sidney Zoltak, who initially had convinced his parents to let him join Selvino with a friend, but finally asked Zeiri to visit his mother in the DP camp in Cremona. But Zeiri did not understand the need of the children and expelled him from the children home. Another example are small but habitual conflicts between Zeiri and the children, which were related to food. One of the children remembered that probably he did not understand that they had, I'm quoting, a special hunger, referring to a sort of obsession concerning food deriving from the traumatic experience of the war. Finally, the tension between the political parties operating in Italy can be analyzed from the letters between Zeiri and one of his closest collaborator, the Italian Jew Matilde Cassin. Soon after the establishment of Selvino, she was finally able to reunite with her fiancé, the Florentine pioneer Max Varadi, who came back from Palestine to Italy as an emissary of a religious Zionist movement, Apoleia Mizrahi. And from Florence, Matilde Cassin addressed dozens of letters to Zeiri in the attempt to find a way to involve her husband-to-be in Selvino. For instance, she wrote, I believe that a perfect collaboration between the three of us would be possible. Are you ready for this, Moshe? I think that our home must not be home for political parties, as we must give our children those spiritual and moral values which are above parties, eternal. We must be able to collaborate all together on the same level, since we all have the same method and the same ideal. To conclude, Matilde Cassin, Moshe Zeiri, and Max Varadi really were working towards the same ideal, taking care of children and youth people and educating them about Aliyah and life in a kibbutz. Moshe Zeiri was aware that Matilde Cassin returning to Selvino was necessary both to alleviate his workload and for the well-being of the children who miss her maternal presence. However, ideologies prevailed and this collaboration never took place. Moshe Zeiri, on the one hand, continued to run Selvino Children Home according to the principle of Gordonia, whereas Max Varadi opened another religious children home in Florence, which is Givat Hayeled, and was opened in 1946 for religious Zionist children. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Chiara. Very interesting. And yeah, it's always interesting to learn from these camps and these approaches and Zahiri and so on. So thank you again.
Thank you.
And now we are already 20 minutes before 6 in Israel, here to 7. And I have the pleasure now to introduce our last speaker for today, which is Esther Bernsen. And she is a psychologist and wrote her thesis about at the Psychosocial Center for Refugees. It's called Zentrum Überleben. It's like a center for survival in Berlin, in which she researched the transgenerational transmission of war trauma. Besides that, she worked for 2 years in a youth welfare facility for traumatized unaccompanied minor refugees in Berlin. And in recent years, she had been working with refugees and still leads an NGO in Berlin, which promotes participation and integration. At the moment, she is working at AMCHA, Germany, and is leading the project Hakara, Confronting Transgenerational Trauma since 2021. This project supports psychosocial care for second-generation Holocaust survivors in Israel. And now it's yours, Esther.
Thank you, Verena. Let me share my screen with you. Okay. Okay. Let me try to. Okay, can you still see my screen without my notes?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to talk to you today on this very important topic that touches different areas in which I have worked with. I started to work with refugees and traumatized populations, as you mentioned before, already during my psychology studies. I also volunteered in refugee camps, and I also worked in a foster care, so I could relate to many things that Jan mentioned before. Yes, and I also worked in my thesis on the topic of transgenerational trauma transmission. Now I work with AMCHA, yeah, I will also tell you a bit more about what this organization does in Israel as well as in Germany. And as you mentioned before, I'm not a historian, but I'm a psychologist, so I will also share this psychological perspective on trauma and its effects. And yeah, it often sounds very, it's always focused on disorders and pathology. So I hope you have this in mind, because it's only one part of the whole picture, but it's this part that I will talk about today. Okay, so I will start right away to tell you a bit more about AMCHA Israel. Most people who are treated today by AMCHA Israel are in fact child survivors. They were on average 13 years old in 1945. And from the beginning on, AMCHA worked not only with the survivors themselves, but also with the families. Psychosocial support for Holocaust survivors and their family is provided in 15 centers around Israel. And in the past years, we can see that when survivors age, they face additional challenges and losses, such as losing a spouse or family members, losing physical and mental capacities. So their needs grow and also the support networks becomes more limited. We can see that these new challenges and losses are layered on challenges and losses from the Holocaust, including unresolved grief and other traumatic experiences. That is why the number of therapy hours is increasing in recent years, but not the number of clients that are treated. Also, the need for therapy in the second generation of survivors have been increasing, as the numbers show. In contrast to AMCHA Israel, AMCHA Germany does not provide direct psychosocial support to survivors or their offspring. AMCHA Germany was founded in 1988 as a support organization for AMCHA Israel. So we support AMCHA financially, but we also run educational projects, for example, in schools, exhibitions, and we work on publications and trainings and exchange for mental health professionals. So now I would like to begin with this quote by the psychologist Krell, in which he describes the experience of child survivors after the war. So silence is the language of the child survivor. We might have talked after the war, but adults persuaded us to get on with life, forget the past. Adults who themselves had survived and suffered so much inadvertently diminished the experience of children. In the aftermath, in that silence which enveloped our existence, what needed saying was not said. So many of the Holocaust survivors that live today were children during World War II. Children who, we heard it before in several talks, children who suffered sudden loss, abandonment, hunger, persecution. And after the war, they made every effort to rebuild their shattered lives. But we have to say that not all succeeded due to these traumatic events. And many, but not all, continue to struggle with their traumatic past. So the psychological consequences of being a child during Holocaust and crisis can be very long-lasting. And now I would like to briefly describe to you the clinical pictures that some psychologists described. Among them is also Nathan Kellerman, who was once the clinical director of AMCHA Israel, and he published many books and articles around the topic of Holocaust studies, child survivors, and also transgenerational transmission of trauma. So there are different impairments that are described also according to the age of the traumatization. And child survivors, they had different ways of coping with the past and the traumatic events. Sometimes they avoided the topic or even had amnesia, and sometimes there was also obsessive preoccupation of the past. So child survivors may be well adapted, but trauma can also manifest itself in a stressful situation even years after. So another big problem for child survivors may be the topic of separations from friends, family members, or even their own children, for example, when they themselves become adults and move out of the house. This can be another very traumatic experience for them. So separations later in life may be experienced as very stressful, and interpersonal relations therefore are sometimes kept shallow to prevent future painful separation from loved ones. So such an early traumatization can really reverberate across the entire lifespan of the child survivor. And many of the early strategies they learned to survive, not only physically, but also mentally, are maintained all through life. Such strategies can be dissociation or numbing, so less feelings, denial, or even amnesia. So these strategies can result in suspicion and also distrust in personal relations. Many clinicians reported that child survivors needed a different psychosocial approach than adult survivors because the memories of children are less verbal, so it's also difficult for them to verbalize those traumatic childhood experiences. And most survivors, they also still suffer from psychological distress symptoms today. And also these symptoms are even more severe even than immediately after the war. And also many child survivors even looked for treatment very late in life, because as I mentioned earlier, when traumatized people grow older, sometimes the experience manifests itself and they have a need for support and for therapy, even in very late in life. And all in all, Nathan Kellerman, he coined the term child survivor syndrome to describe this clinical picture of survivors who were in need for support and therapy. And this concept is very similar to the concept or the diagnosis of complex PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, which is the diagnosis in the ICD-11 by the World Health Organization. And it can be found often after severe and multiple or sequential traumatization. So it's often not only one event, but several and over a longer period of time. Among these symptoms are re-experiencing the traumatic event, avoidance and numbing, hyperarousal, and also flashbacks and nightmares, among others. So we can say that many, not all, but many child survivors suffered mentally all through her life from the experiences, and this impaired their own well-being, but also their social life and their relationships in families, and especially with their own children when they had family and children later. The trauma, as I mentioned earlier, affected the children of the child survivors. This was started to being reported in the 60s or late 60s and 70s by clinicians who reported that many second generation clients were in therapy, which suggested for them that the second generation was also affected by their parents' experience. And they started to research and talk about the term transgenerational transmission of trauma. What does it mean? It basically means that people are affected by collective violence who were not directly exposed to the traumatic events. So children report, for example, to have nightmares about camps and persecution, even in families where nobody even directly spoke about their traumatic experience. So the question was, are the generations tied to each other, or can the offspring disentangle from the traumatic experience of their parents? The phenomenon of the transgenerational transmission has been described and studied worldwide in different populations. So in war veterans, survivors of the genocide in Rwanda, survivors of Fukushima and Nagasaki, and also in refugee populations. But most evidence comes from Holocaust survivors and their families. And the transmission in Holocaust families has been also described extensively in literature, in film, in documentaries, in graphic novels. So not only in scientific publications, but from the late 60s on, it was also described by mental health professionals, especially in Israel. And until now, even though there is a lot of research, there's still a topic in dispute, because in the beginning, studies did not show consistent findings. They were researching what is transferred, and in the beginning, they thought there was a direct transmission of symptoms from one generation to the other. And they also discussed and researched how it is transferred, what is the mechanism. But all in all, we can say that with randomized controlled studies in non-clinical populations, those studies failed to confirm the assumption of an increased rate of psychopathology in the offspring of Holocaust survivors. But, trauma transmission is therefore not an inevitable consequence of the parent's traumatization, but it can be an outcome of various different factors. Some of them I show here, and I will only mention that one thing that could be shown consistently is a vulnerability for PTSD, for post-traumatic stress syndrome, in the second generation. So the transmission of trauma manifests itself in specific circumstances. For example, when the second generation themselves are facing traumatic events such as war, cancer, or a pandemic. And it makes the children of survivors more vulnerable to suffer from post-traumatic stress when they experience this kind of stress. The mechanism, so why or how this happens, is still being discussed and researched, and I will not really go into detail here because the time is very limited. So knowing this, we understand trauma as a process and not a single incident that is over at some point. And we can also gain a common understanding of trauma among survivors of collective violence, children and adults, and a common ground for psychosocial work with traumatized persons, and the conditions that are necessary for effective treatment and rehabilitation. So, and I think this is also very relevant today in Germany, where a great number of refugees live, who come from countries where they experienced war, loss of family members, and often a traumatic journey to even come here. And we heard about this in the talk, for example, by Graf earlier. So I will share briefly with you some numbers of adults and children who came to Germany and the prevalence of trauma and post-traumatic stress in these populations. So on average, there's a study that shows that on average, 30% of the refugees have a diagnosis of a PTSD. So meaning in Germany alone, we had in 2019, roughly 500,000 refugees with that diagnosis. This is an estimation. And then here's the numbers of minors who applied for asylum in Germany in 2020, which was around 55,000. And I estimate that the prevalence of trauma and post-traumatic stress is even higher in this population. Okay, so what can we learn from the past? I would suggest a multimodal support over the life cycle for the individuals, because recovering from trauma is a lifelong process, and we have to provide supports such as psychotherapeutic, social, legal support, and medical whenever the need emerges. This can be in different life periods and does not always have to be right after a crisis. And we can also define common principles for understanding trauma and shaping psychosocial interventions. I will just briefly mention two key necessary elements that were also developed on a exchange between Israeli and German mental health professionals. Those are recognition and community. Community is needed to heal the traumatic past, especially when it's caused by man-made trauma. So establishing, promoting, and maintaining communities is a necessary condition for the provision of mental health care and interventions. And community and support is also needed for the helpers because they are sometimes faced with isolation, with burnout, with pessimism, and with a big workload. And this is also something I know from my experience when I worked in a youth welfare organization. So, and the next and the last point is recognition. Because trauma resulting from collective violence and displacement caused by political and social factors also affect the political and societal space. So it is the society who has the responsibility to treat traumatized persons and populations and to enable them to reintegrate into society. Recognizing the suffering and harm that was experienced by the victims and the survivors especially of man-made violence is of very high importance for their recovery, and the injustice and the harm done to them must be recognized. And the person who suffered from trauma and injustice must be supported immediately and in long term, so they can live in safety and heal from their traumatic past. The awareness and the willingness of the society to recognize and treat traumatized people and populations is therefore a precondition to alleviate the burden of trauma in a person's life. And with this, I would like to end my presentation. I will share with you my email address if you would like to reach out. I will be happy if you get in touch, and thank you.
Yes, Esther, thank you. And we are we are at the end of another very interesting panel. And I think we have some more, little time left for some questions, because I saw there were some questions, or one question to Chiara and one question to Esther. Maybe the audience or the people who ask this can ask it now.
Oh, read it.
Yeah, but I have to search it. Here. So the first question to Chiara.
It has two versions.
Yes. Because from maybe you repeat the question, Chiara, or shall I read it? Question to Chiara. It's on the frames of criteria to joining to AMCHA was cases of discrimination on background of social and socio-economic belonging.
I'm not sure I got the question, but in the particular context of the refugee camps, many were affiliated to AMCHA, especially in Italy, which was a sort of was defined as the gate to Zion. So the last stop before going to Palestine. Many hoped to do so in a very quick time, but many of them had to wait a long time. I never find, I didn't find any evidence of discrimination as a motivation to join AMCHA or AMCHA. But for instance, for religious DPs was a little bit complicated at the beginning, because they didn't have political representation among. They had to fight to get to be recognized as a political group and to find their representative from Ahi or Agudat Israel. But at the end, they had their AMCHA. But yeah, at the beginning was a little bit discriminating, because the context of the Jewish units of the the Palestinian units was secular, predominantly secular, so they had to fight to get their own AMCHA.
I will.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
There's one more question to Esther.
Yes, there's another question by Mr. Shmuel Yerushalmi, which and he asked Esther if it is a syndrome of survivor children. I understand the question like of survivor children. Is it a syndrome of survivor children having any impacts also on grandsons and great-grandsons of Holocaust survivors?
Yeah, thank you, Shmuel, for the question. Actually, there is a lot of research that is dealing with the question whether or how or what has been transmitted to the grandchildren and grand-grandchildren. I have to admit, I'm not an expert on the third and fourth generation, but there is literature and some evidence that it also affected the third and the fourth generation.
Okay, so we come to the finishing remarks. Verena.
So maybe, boss, you wanted to start or shall I start? Maybe you?
You start.
Okay, so it was again, thank you to the speakers, first of all, and thank you, the audience, which is still left now. And yes, it was always a pleasure. It was again a pleasure to have you here. And I think I just made some notes about research questions from the past, which are relevant for today and the other way around. For example, what I find interesting about this transition process about which Jan spoke, for example, into an independent life, I think this would be also interesting to focus more on the past and so on. Yeah, and this is what we would like also to stress today, because we are at the moment in the process of establishing a larger project on bringing past and present together, and we are always grateful for any hints or tips or collaboration with other researchers or practitioners. Yes. Was?
Okay, I think it turned out that to do a project on war and do a Holocaust affected children on the day of a new war in Europe is very strong in a way. And I think that we really saw today, like Verena said, that the questions work both ways. Like researchers coming from academy have a lot to learn from the people in the field, to know what questions they should ask on the work, on the people they are researching, on the children that are researching. On the other hand, I believe, we believe this is actually the bulwark of the main claim of our project, is that also people today can be enriched, and people working today can gain from learning how people did relate to these issues 70 years ago. Of course, there were a lot of child refugees in the middle also. We are not inventing the wheel. It's not that the historians have some big truth that the people in the field don't know. But when we started the project, I went to speak in the ICC in The Hague. I gave a guest lecture on this concept. And I don't know, one of the big judges there, he said that actually the importance of the historian's work is that it can open the horizons for the people working today. In the same way that we are learning now that the people, the learning about the work today opens the horizons of the historians looking at the children of the past. As Verena said, we are interested in collaborating with this and with other people. We are interested to build research projects on this in interdisciplinary, past and present. We are really, we want to hear more. I will, so we will really finish with a prayer for a prayer. I'm not doing religious coercion here, but it, in any prayer for the children now undergoing now the terrors of war, and pray for a swift ending to this situation. So thank you, everyone. Be in touch with us, and we will be happy to meet you again. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Due to the amazing speakers we had.
Bye.